So I'm just going to get started. We're not planning to show too many slides today, just a couple to set the scene, and then we'll go right into a demo. Now, one of the main challenges that Qualibrate is trying to kind of attach itself to is on projects, there's a lot of waste and a lot of duplicate effort, especially when it comes to project quality. And what you see is that in order to have a successful implementation, so it could be a digital transformation program, it could be an S/4HANA journey, what you find is in order for the project to be a success, there's a number of kind of, let's say, deliverables that must be created throughout the project lifecycle in order to make sure you've got a high quality system into production. And typically where that starts is you start your program and you go through a business process documentation exercise. This is normally a high level overview of your business processes. So if you think about it like order to cash, procure to pay, this activity is typically done by business analysts in an organization, maybe using a business process mapping tool like an ARIS, maybe even SAP Solution Manager Blueprint. Now, once they've described the application at a high level, what then happens is you start to create manual test cases, which basically define the steps that are required to make sure that that process is actually working in the target system. So a manual test would include the steps that are required to be performed in a system, maybe the test data and the users that are required, and also some kind of expected result, what would happen if certain actions take place within the system. Now, manual test cases could be created in Excel or Word. Maybe customers are using a dedicated ALM tool for that, but it's normally a separate activity from the business process documentation, and it's normally done by their key users or even dedicated manual testers who know the steps that need to be performed in the actual application. Now, more and more customers these days want to benefit from automation. It could be that you want to get faster, let's say, solutions into production. So you want to do that in an automated way in a continuous delivery pipeline. It could be that you want to, in a shorter period of time, test more functionality more frequently. So you look towards automation so that you can basically increase the number of machines that are executing rather than the number of people and get results in a faster time. Now, for test automation, that's a slightly different skill. Normally, you would be looking at a test automation engineer using a dedicated test automation tool. There are several out there. And basically what they would do is a similar exercise to creating a manual test case, but creating it in a test automation tool and taking into consideration things like setting up data, because if you run them overnight or at the weekend, they have to be able to maintain themselves. So you want to get the test case to create its own data, use its own data, and at the end of the test kind of reset itself so it can be run again. And finally, once you've run your automated scripts and your application is working, what you need to make sure when you're rolling out new functionality is that you train your end user. Now, especially in large SAP implementations, what you often find is that user acceptance testing is done as a kind of training exercise. So for the first time, before users get to use the system, they'll go through a user acceptance testing cycle, and that will also be combined into a training exercise to let them know how the new functionality is working. Now, if you think about these, let's say these 4 steps, before you can actually put anything into your production environment, this happens for every single process. But not only every single process, it happens every time there's a change in your application. So once you've done the implementation and you've got an application in production, every time there's a change to an interface, maybe a change to a patch being released by SAP, maybe new functionality, maybe a change request from the business, what you need to do is again go in, update your business process documentation, update the manual test that basically verifies that the business process is working correctly. If you want to benefit from automation, then you update your automated test script. And then finally, before you can release it into production, you have to create training material for your end users. Now, on some of the customers that we worked for, they were actually had 4 different people doing this exercise on even 4 different tools. And of course, that becomes very inefficient because if you have to do that, then it takes a long time for you to get any of your changes through into production. And also to keep everything in sync becomes a large overhead on the project. So this is exactly let's say the problem that Qualibrate is solving. What we aim to do is instead of having 4 different people with 4 different tools, we have one single tool. With that tool, we give it to the right user who can document the business processes. They can be used to execute in a manual way as test cases against the application. They can be run automated, so they can be run unattended, even as part of a continuous delivery pipeline, and training materials so that end users are basically able to expose themselves to the system, but with kind of guidelines and walkthrough, and even access to the application in a kind of simulation. So that's the idea behind Qualibrate. That's what we're trying to achieve, and that's what we're doing with our customers. So now I'm just going to go straight in, and we're going to create a business process within Qualibrate and show how it can be executed in these different ways. Okay, so I'm in the Qualibrate application. I'm just going to log into my project. And when I go into my project, I'm immediately taken to the dashboard screen. And dashboards are just exactly what you would think. It's configurable widgets that basically give you an overview of your project. Here we've got some pre-built ones that show the number of defects, the number of flows, which is a concept that I'm going to come back and talk on. Things like the status of flows, the severity of flows, also the defects, who they're assigned to, and a flow against the execution trend over time. There's other information you can see. For example, we have a concept called scenarios. We can see how many scenarios are there. We can see how many have been executed, a cumulative run. We can also look at, again, the flows, and we can see that we've got some flows tagged. We've got SAP flows. We've got Salesforce flows. And again, I'm going to come back to this. But the dashboards are configurable widgets. You can go in, you can add your own. You can basically report on any, let's say, information that's sitting within Qualibrate. Now, the most important concepts I want to get across today in this webinar are the concepts of flows and scenarios. Flows you can think about like building blocks. So for an example, creating a sales order is a flow. Now, if you think about SAP, a sales order is used in an end-to-end scenario, like an order to cash. So the flow would be creating a sales order, and the scenario would be order to cash. The flows are like reusable building blocks. You create them. You use them in scenarios. If you change your business process, you update the flow once, and your scenarios are updated automatically. So a kind of object-oriented approach to, let's say, designing automated test scripts, manual tests, and training material. So let's go in and create a new flow. So I'm going to go in. This is the flows that are currently existing. I'm going to choose to create a new one. I'll call it webinar, create quotation. This is a simple create quotation. I'll give it a description. We can mark a severity. That's useful, for example, if later on you're pressed for time and you'll want to execute the most critical, let's say, processes first because of time. So you can mark them. You can also give them a different status, or you can add tags. For example, this one is an SAP one. So I'm going to save that. And once it's saved, I come to let's say, a blank canvas. Now we can add steps manually by going in and documenting let's say, the process that I want to capture. But I can also just automatically go in and start recording it. And when I record it, what happens is a little widget opens over here, so you can see it. The widget has some different buttons, which I'll explain. There's a save, which saves the recording. There's a verify, which I'm going to show during the demo. You can verify different parts of the application to make sure something is as expected. You can take notes. You can store values. Storing values is useful. For example, if you create a quotation in SAP, you're given a quotation number. You probably want to use that quotation number to create a sales order. So you can store the quotation number, and when you go to create the sales order, you can then reuse the quotation number. That means that your test can run unattended, because every time it creates a quotation, it will then use that unique quotation number. And I can also cancel the recording. Now, the first thing I need to do is give my task a name. So I'm going to give it the name of SAP Login. I'm going to go to my SAP system. I'm going to connect. I'm going to put in my username. I'm going to put in my password. And I'm going to hit enter. Now, what you can see actually is that Qualibrate was doing something. So if we open this up and I scroll back, you can see that the first step was to connect to SAP. You can see the server that I connected to. The next step is to type in a user. I entered in user 11. I can change it. I can also add some notes. So I could say user 11 is test user for sales rep and NL. I can save that. Next step is to enter a password. By default, my password is encrypted, but all the parameters can be changed here during the recording, or I can change them afterwards. Then the next step is to press enter on SAP. So that's fine for my what we call login chapter. Now I'm going to create a new chapter called create quotation. I'm going to go to the create quotation transaction VA21. I'll enter in a quotation type. I'll enter in a sales org, distribution channel, at a division. I'll hit enter. Be taken to the next screen. On the next screen, I'm going to enter in my ship to party and my sold to party. and I'll put in delivery date for, yeah, actually, let's make it for 14. I'll put in a material, and I'll put in a order quantity, and I'll hit enter. So now I've basically creating a simple quotation in SAP. SAP is thinking about it. It's now giving me a response. So what you can see now is it's accepted the quotation, give me a net value. Now also in Qualibrate, there's some things that I might want to, let's say, do a verification on. So for example, I'm going to do a verification on this net value. So that's 15,600. Here, if I open up the details of it, you can see I've done a verify, I've done the net value, and I'm checking for a recorded value of 15,600. Now that's fine, but I have the option to also go in and do a configuration. So here you can see that the moment I'm doing a verification to make sure that it contains 15,600, and if I evaluate that in real time, it's true. I can also change that, so I can say, well, actually, I want to check that it doesn't. So I want to do a negative test and it's false. But actually, for the purpose of this one, we want to actually make sure it's identical. So we're going to change it to equals, and that's correct. I'm just going to save it. And then finally, I'm not going to save this quotation because it's just the purposes of the demo. We're just going to create a new chapter for logging off SAP. And then I'll go down and I'll exit out of my SAP. So now all it's left to do is just to save the recording in Qualibrate, go back into our web application where we manage everything, and the recording's been saved. Now what you can see here is that basically the chapters that we created, the SAP login, the create quotation, the SAP log off, have been grouped together, and the steps underneath them, you can see, first step is connect to SAP. There's a screenshot of the SAP screen. The second step is to type a user in the user field. Here's the description where I put in user 11 is the test user for the sales rep in the Netherlands. You can see a screenshot. The field is highlighted. If you want more technical information, if you're interested in that for automation properties, you don't need it, but you can check things like the object properties of the technical objects. You can make them mandatory or not. Use regular expressions. For more advanced users, it's not really necessary, and I'll show you why. You can export this data as a variable. That just means you can expose it for later on. So for example, I might want to use user 11 in another variable later on, so I can then export it. I can change the action type. At the moment, it's a type. So this is basically what we call a digital document. Shows you all the steps. The next step is to type in the password. It shows you a screenshot with the field highlighted. And for anyone who's not familiar with how this process of creating a quotation would work, they can log into Qualibrate. They can go through the steps. The next step is the next chapter is to create a quotation. So go to VA21, put in the quotation, put in the sales organization, the distribution channel, the division, press enter, put in the sold to party, the ship to party, right down to the final part where we do the validation on the net value. So this is what we call a digital document. Screenshots are automatically taken. All the data has been populated in a data file, which we'll also show. And this is now ready basically to be executed. So there's a few different ways I can execute it. First one, I'm just going to run it automatically. And I'll let it execute against the SAP system. And it's basically just going to perform the exact same steps that I recorded, right? So it's going in, put in the quotation type, sold to party, shipped to party, material, the quantity, pressing enter. Going to do a calculation, net value appears. We're going to do a verification on the net value, and then we're going to log out. So let's take a look at the logs. In the logs, you can see here we have our first log. We've got the name of the flow, which is a webinar create quotation, the laptop it ran on, who ran it, that's me, how long it took. If we expand everything, you can see all the steps. So the first step is to log in and connect to SAP, type in a user. We use user 11. Again, there's a screenshot taken during runtime. We can see the elapsed time for each of the steps, what we're actually doing. So we typed in the password, press enter, then we went on to the next chapter to create a quotation. This was run in an automated way. The data we used was VA21 for the transaction. Press enter, we put in a quotation type, QT, we put in a sales org 1000, we put in the distribution channel. Again, all the steps. So this is full audit trail, including screenshots, username that executed it, data that was used, and the start time and the lapse time. All the way down to the final step in the, let's say, the process where we verified the net value. So this is very handy. This is a useful automated test. Typically, you would use this, especially if you're running regression. So you have a bunch of these split over maybe a few machines. You run them every time there's a change in your application to your core processes to make sure that your core processes are still working. You can do that unattended. You can do that overnight. You can do it as part of a continuous delivery pipeline where you've got a number of steps in a process before you run your automated script. If your automated scripts are successful, they send back a pass, and you can go on and finish your build. Now, the other way that we can use this is more for either, let's say, a training or a user acceptance testing. And then we're going to run same, let's say, process, but in what we call in a manual way. So when we run it in a manual way, what happens is we get the same, let's say, chapters that we have in the web application. We get them in a slightly different configuration here on the right-hand side. So you can see first chapter is SAP log on, second is create quotation, the third is SAP log off. Exactly the same as here. Now, if we expand the first one, the first step is to connect to SAP, and I've got a number of buttons down here, so I can pass the step, I can fail the step, I can skip the step. Now, if we go into our SAP application, first step is to connect to SAP, so I'm going to try and connect. I was able to do that, so I can mark it as passed. Step will be passed, so you can see in green, and I'm on to the next step, which is to type in the username. So here I can say, okay, type in the username, user11. Now there is some additional buttons. One of them is called show me. So here I've got a step saying type in the user field. Well, quite self-explanatory. Here's the user field. But if I'm not sure, well, I can check the description, because in the description I have some text that I recorded during the recording. It says user11 is a test user for sales rep. So if that's not clear for me, I can also say, well, why don't you show me? And when you press show me, it actually highlights the fields that it wants you to interact with in the application. So you can imagine that if this is a user acceptance testing session and you're getting access to the application for the first time and the user is either not familiar with the process or not even familiar with SAP, this is a kind of interactive guide which can show them what to do in the actual application itself. So here I've got to enter in user11. I was able to do that. So again, I'm going to mark it as passed. Shows up in green. Next step is to enter the password. Now again, I can say show me. But what I can also do is, it could be the case, especially if I'm doing user acceptance testing, that I'm just interested in the final validation. I'm not really interested in the going through the steps to create a quotation. So here I can just say, do it for me, and it will fill in the value. So it's entered the password in, and it's in a slightly different color. The lighter green means that it's done in a manual way. The darker green means it's done automated. The next step is press enter. I'm going to say again, do it for me. And when I press enter, it's automatically clicked for me and passed by Qualibrate. So the next step is to go to VA21. I'm just going to say, do it for me. Next step is press enter. I'm going to say, do it for me. Then quotation type, I'm going to say, do it for me. And it's enter the sales organization. I can say, show me. And we'll highlight the sales organization field. Then I can say, do it for me, etc. So this is very handy, especially if you're doing a user acceptance testing cycle. Our customers really love this because this allows them to give the, let's say, Qualibrate to people who are maybe not familiar with new processes or even unfamiliar with how SAP works itself. And this can, let's say, guide them through parts of the application, or even just let them do the parts that are monotonous in an automatic way, and they can do the verifications manually that they're really interested. For example, the net value verification at the end. Now, just for the purpose of this demo, let's assume that we want to type in a value in the division, but we're not able to. What I can also do is I can fail a step. That will mark the step in red. I can say, well, actually, I want to then add a defect. Adding a defect will automatically go into Qualibrate, create a new defect. Okay, I found a bug. Gives me all the steps that are required to reproduce. So this is very handy. So for the developer, all the, let's say, the information that was up to the point of finding this defect is here. So it's automatically created. The developer will get that information. I can select what's been affected. I can choose the severity. I can assign it to, let's say, Marina, and I can say it was reported by me, wherever I am. So very useful, especially during user acceptance testing, kind of interactive way to work with the application, to go through to either kind of exploratory testing or user acceptance testing, or even just interactive training. And once you find any issues, you can automatically populate and create defects within Qualibrate, all just by hitting the defect button. So I'm just going to close this one. I'm not going to save it just for the purposes of the demo. Okay, so let me just close down my SAP session. Close this one down. Okay, so we've just a quick recap. We've recorded a simple process in SAP for creating quotation. From that, we've created a digital document which has all the screenshots, logical text, and all the data that's required for understanding how the process works. That can then be executed in an automatic way, so it can be run by machine overnight, unattended at the weekend, as part of a continuous delivery pipeline. Can be run in a manual way, either for training or user acceptance testing, where you have an interactive guide, so a way to interact with the actual SAP or the target test application with some control. And what we finally want to look at before we start looking at scenarios is how we manage the data set. So once we've done an original recording, a data set is recorded. And what you can see here is the steps within the data. So here is the user that I used, the password for logging in. You can see that I went to transaction BA21. I typed in 1,000 in the sales organization. So this is pretty useful because I can also, of course, I can manipulate these values. I can change them. I can make it 2,000. Doesn't matter. But when it comes to especially these large SAP projects, what you often find is you have a core template, or you have processes that are the same, but maybe are executed by different business units or even in different countries with different sets of data. So what we can do is we can create a duplicate data set. I'm going to call it EMEA sales. I'm going to save it. And then what I'm going to do is, because it can be very handy, especially for the business who are very familiar with Excel usually, is you can export this to Excel. And let me open it up. You can see it. And what you have here is basically a different representation of the data, right? So you can see here we've got the session that we connected to, the username, the password, the transaction that we go to, the quotation type, the sales organization, the distribution channel, division, etc. Now, let's say, for example, this is a core process. So it's a process we've created on our template, but I want to execute it in maybe multiple countries. So I can call this one loop 2, loop 3. I can say loop 1 is user 11, user 12 for loop 2, and user 13 for loop 3. I can say sales organization 1,000 for the first one. Could be the 3,000, 2,000 for the second one, and 3,000. And these would typically represent maybe different countries, right? So this could be, let's say, Germany, France, Netherlands for business units. Now, what I can do is I can then save that Excel file. I can then import it back into Qualibrate. And what you can see is now I've created a new, let's say, way of running through. I've got 3 different loops. The first one is going to use user 11, second one user 12, third one user 13. First one is going to put in sales org 1,000, second one 2,000, third one 3,000. This is very handy because what you can basically do is you can have a quality team that's creating the documentation, the manual tests, and the automated tests on your project. You can have them running against the core system on a regular basis. If you're doing a rollout to multiple countries, you can export the data. You can give the data set to the business. They can fill it in Excel. They don't even need access to Qualibrate. You can just put in the rows of data that they would like to be, let's say, executed so that the rollout from their perspective is a success. And then you just add it to your regression set in Qualibrate and you just execute for those particular rows, depending either if you're doing it for a specific country or if you're doing a full regression. Okay, so the final part of Qualibrate is what we're going to look at is scenarios. So the flows are what we call building blocks. We looked at the create quotation as an example of that. A scenario would be, let's say, an order to cash. So let's just create a new scenario. We'll call it webinar order to cash example. Again, I can change the severity or the status and can add tags. Then once I have it, I have basically a blank canvas. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look for my flow. So the first flow that I'm going to put in this scenario is the webinar create quotation. You can see I can choose the data set that I want to work with. So I can say I'm going to use the EMEA sales data set that I just created, and I want to run this in an automated way. I can also go in and add, let's say, once we've created a quotation, I can add a sales order process. So I can go running a quotation and then run a sales order. Once I've run a sales order, I can go and do, let's say, an outbound delivery. And then I can do some invoicing. Now, what you see here is I can choose the data set that can be executed, but I can also choose the run mode. So, for example, it could be that we've got an order to cash process. It might be that the only part that's changed is the invoicing. So I'm not really interested in the create quotation, sales order, and delivery parts of the process because they haven't actually changed, and I know that. So I want to be sure that I focus my time on the right area, and I might want to do a manual check on the invoicing process. So what this means is when I run this scenario, the first 3 flows will be run in an automated way, unattended by the machine. But the fourth scenario, that the invoicing process, will basically be expected to be executed manually, but someone is going in and doing the validations themselves. Okay, so that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of Qualibrate. Within it, just to recap, we had a look at the dashboard. Dashboards basically show you all the functionality, everything that's reported within Qualibrate. What we do is we create flows. Flows are the building blocks that we use to basically create end-to-end scenarios or test across the whole application. Here again is what one of the, let's say, flows looks like. The flows have data sets attached to them. We can manipulate those data sets. We can export them to Excel. We can also change the data directly here, of course. I can, of course, make add user 15. And then once we've got our flows, we put them into scenarios, and scenarios are basically executed on demand in either an automated or a manual way using whatever data set that you want. You can raise defects. Defects can be raised automatically from an execution run and pre-populated as well. So Martina, do we have any questions?
So first of all, Stephen, thank you very much. That looks pretty straightforward. Yeah, indeed, we have some questions. So I would start with it, with the first one, which is, do you integrate with any CI/CD tools?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So the 2 answers. One is yes, we do. A good example is we have a large customer in the Netherlands. It's a brewery. They have a tool called Atomic, which is they use for their kind of CI/CD process. So they provision an environment, they transport data across, they manipulate that data. That then raises a call to Qualibrate CLI, command line interface, which runs a bunch of Qualibrate tests and sends back the results. If the results of the test fail, then let's say the process stops. If the results pass, then they basically continue the process. Qualibrate has a REST API, so that means that everything can be exposed or hooked into anything that can work with APIs.
Cool. Then another one, simple one, but is Qualibrate working only for SAP ECC?
No. Qualibrate is working for SAP and web applications. When we talk about SAP, we talk about technology. So for us, you have SAP GUI, which is one technology, and then SAP Web, which has multiple technologies, but basically if it's in a browser, we support it. We also support web applications like Salesforce. In fact, most of our customers are also using Salesforce for their CRM.
And let's go back to the integration one. How about integration with Jira? That's another question.
Yeah. Same story as let's say the Atomic. We have a REST API and a CLI, so we can basically integrate with anything, and we also integrate with Jira. So you can have defects sent across as issues in Jira.
All right. These are all the questions that we have for now. Feel free to reach us out if you have any specific need or any specific request. Thank you, Stephen, for your time. Thank you all for taking the time to participate. What we are going to do tomorrow is share the recorded session with you. So feel free to share it with anyone you want, with your colleagues. And as I said, don't hesitate to reach us out in case you have any specific needs. Thank you all for joining, and have a nice evening.